Elpidio Barzaga Jr., Roy Loyola, Sergio Dagook, Jose G. Piedjeros. The committee would also like to acknowledge the presence of the following resource persons and guests today: Dr. Raymund Narag from the Southern Illinois University, from the Office of the Court Administrator of the Supreme Court, Honorable Court Administrator Raul Villanueva, from the DILG, Attorney Enrico Alday, from the Public Attorney's Office, the Honorable Presider Rueda Acosta, Chief Public Attorney. From the Bureau of Corrections, we have Deputy Director General Al Pereiras. From the Bureau of Jail Management and Criminology, we have the Chief BJMP Jail Director Ruel Rivera and Jail Chief Superintendent Baby Noel Montalvo. From the Board of Pardon and Parole, Attorney Sergio Calizo Jr., the Chairperson of the BPP. From the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, we have the National President Attorney Antonio Pido, Attorney Marcelino Michael Atenante IV, and Attorney Maylene Yu Palisok. The honorable members, the following honorable members are also present: the Honorable Raul Angelo Gil Bongalon and the Honorable Olga Araco via Zoom. Your Honor.
Thank you, Comsec. We now proceed to the meeting proper. For a briefing on jail and prison decongestion, the chair recognizes Dr. Raymund Narag for his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. This is an opportunity of a lifetime for me. This is an event that I've been dreaming on, and I just want to thank you all for your presence and hearing that testimony that I'm going to share today. The title of my presentation is Jail and Prison Congestion: the Causes, the Consequences, and some proposed solutions that could be entertained by our legislators. And for today, this is the outline of my presentation. First, I'm going to discuss the current state of the Philippine criminal and correctional justice system. And then, based on the research that we have conducted for the past 20 years or so, I'm going to share an overall framework to understand our current conditions. And then, from this analysis of the realities in the field, we are going to share some of the proposed solutions that could be utilized by our honorable congresspersons. Before I start, I would like to note the methodology of this research. For many of these things that I'm going to say, this is a product of my research, where I started when I did my PhD in criminology and criminal justice at Michigan State University. And then I've been doing a lot of trainings for our Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, and they are here today, sir. Thank you very much. And also for the Bureau of Corrections, and currently we are doing a training for the 1,000 people there in the Bureau of Corrections, the Parole and Probation Agency, and also different court actors, officers, and many others in the criminal justice system. But also, this is a product of my own personal story and autoethnography. I was once an inmate in Quezon City Jail. I was accused of a crime I did not commit. I was put in jail for 6 years, 9 months, and 4 days to be exact. I was accused of a crime that eventually led me to detention in one of the most crowded facilities in the Philippines. And some of these officers are here today in the Quezon City Jail. And so I share this testimony in behalf of all the inmates languishing in jail, of all the parents who have been visiting their children in jail as well. And I would like to acknowledge my father and my sister who are here with me to support in this advocacy. So this is the story that I'm going to share. It's a product of research, but it's a product of advocacy rooted by a very strong personal experience. So let me begin. what is the current situation in our justice system? First, we have the dubious notion or recognition as one of the most congested jail and prison conditions in the whole universe. We are only second to Haiti on these regards. On average, right now, our congestion rate for our prison and jails is 356%. Sometimes it varies to 370, sometimes goes down to 320. This has improved a lot compared in 2016 during the start of the drug war, when we are at 650%, when we were the #1 for 3 years. But still, as the BJMP and the Bucor would testify later, there are many jails and prisons that are beyond 1,000% congestion. In fact, there are jails that have been congested for 3,000%. Additionally to this, the Philippines hosts the biggest mega prison complex in the world. And this is the New Bilibid prison. It is as big as a small city. It has 29,000 persons deprived of liberty in it. It's designed for 8,000. So imagine how you cram these people inside a small facility. On the other hand, we also have one of the slowest pace of case dispositions in the world. In my research about the length of stay in detention for no bail offenses, it will be around 3.2 years. I stayed in jail for 6 years and 9 months, so I'm just within the range. However, there are many extreme cases. For example, if you look at the files in Manila District Jail right now, there are inmates who have stayed in detention for 23 long years and still ongoing trial. They haven't been found guilty yet. Of course, they are accused of a very serious offense, but still, it speaks of the slowest space. I've looked at the consequences in my research of the effects of this pretrial detention, congestion, and delay in hearings. First, it affects the persons deprived of liberty. One, it translates to very poor living conditions. The Commission on Human Rights nonetheless mentioned that our jails are not fit for human habitation. It has now affected our human dignity. It leads to health concerns, disease transmissions, and mental health. In my latest research in Metro Manila jails, for example, around 40 inmates die every month because of diseases. Take note, they are pretrial detainees. Because of the congestion as well, we have reduced access to programs. We have elevated levels of violence. If you have seen the video that came out around last month about the riot in one of our jails in Metro Manila, that's just one of the manifestations. And then it increased level of recidivism. Recidivism rate for BJMP hovers around 20 to 30%, higher in other Metro Manila jails. The Bucor has around 20 to 30% as well. So many of our releases come back into prison. And of course, the bizarre practices. Sometimes we see stories about practices that are out of the ordinary in our prisons. And why is this the case? This is always the media attention that gathers the most interest. For our personnel, and again, the BJMP and the Bucor people will attest, they are also exposed to very poor working conditions. Many of them also succumb to sickness because of their exposure to diseases. It leads to job turnover, burnout, because once they get a better grasp of the roles, they turn to better pastures. And of course, this is the most incredible thing. It could lead them to susceptibility to corruption. And we'll explain that more in a bit. But on top of that, it affects our criminal justice system written large. Why? Because it adds additional cost to the government. We spend 70 pesos per day per inmate for food, 15 pesos per day for medicine. That's 85 pesos. If you look at it in summa total, we spend around 110 pesos per PDL in a year of incarceration. That's even more than what we spend for a UP student who is a scholar ng bayan. It also leads to delays and inequality of treatment. Of course, people with money will try to best in order to improve their life. People without money will stay longer. And then, of course, it leads to legal cynicism. Legal cynicism is a concept where people don't trust our system. They took matters into their own hands. They don't go to the police. They rather exact vengeance. They don't trust the courts. They don't trust our corrections. And so it leads to different acts of terrorism as well. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the current state the criminal justice system has been in our country for quite a while. In my research, I devoted the last 20 years of my life doing this. I realized that we could analyze the problem in multiple domains. One is the societal values. What are the values in our society that leads to this? Second, legal variables. What are the laws that have been enacted by Congress and Senate that eventually contributes to our situation? That's why this is a very great opportunity for us to present for our congressmen today. We could also look at the structural conditions, the organization of coping mechanisms, and the cultural structures that have developed in our facilities in response to the neglect in our society and legal institutions. Also, one of the ways to analyze the situation is to look at it from multiple stages. And this is from the input, throughput, and output. The more people come in, it leads to congestion. The longer is the throughput, the higher is the congestion. And if there's limited output, it also leads to congestion. So it's better for us to look step by step, what are the policies and procedures that increases input, makes the throughput very slow, and make the output very little. Because even if we build more jails, build more prisons, it will still be full to the brim the year after. Why? Because it's like a field of dreams. Build and it shall come. So in order to make a rational criminal justice system, we have to look at the input, throughput, and output lens of analysis. And then finally, sometimes we always see the problem in the corrections, problem in the jail, problem in the prisons, but they are at the very last stages. They are the repository of our actions. So we have to look at what does the law enforcement do? What does the court do? Because eventually it will be inherited by our correctional system. So the key here, ladies and gentlemen, is to understand the root cause of the problem, the root cause of congestion from a very dispassionate point of view. Let's look at the big picture. Sometimes it's easy to point blame to certain individuals, certain institutions, but eventually, if you look at the big picture, we see that we all contribute to the problem, and we could also contribute to the solutions of the problem, because it has a feedback loop. What happens to the next will impact the behavior of the next activities. So in our research in criminology and criminal justice, this is the theoretical framework that we use. First, we look at the societal values, which affects the mandates, the laws that we pass here in Congress. And then it affects the characteristics of the organization. And in understanding the characteristics of the organization, we have to look at the structural conditions. And then how the structural conditions affect the organizational mandates and the culture that evolve. And then, of course, the different outcomes. And here we now understand why riots happen, why drug dealing happens, why there will be contrabands, why there will be cabals, things that titillate our imagination every time it's taken up by the social media and public media. So let's look at the current situation. Based on my ongoing research, what we found is that the Filipino public has a very strong emphasis on crime control, which is very legitimate and true. We want our families to be safe from crime, from snatchers in Cubao and elsewhere. We want to have law and order. We want to have public safety. And then there's this fear of crime. Many of the things that are passed is because of the public fear of crime. And this is understandable. In our research, we call this in the United States penal populism. Penal populism is a concept where you use the penal structures in order to address fear of crime. That's why many of our people clamor for harsher, longer sentences. And they would want everybody to be put in detention. You throw a garbage, put in detention. You violate smoking, put in detention. Everything will be put in imprisonment. And this detention is the first resort. And currently, ladies and gentlemen, our philosophy of punishment has been retribution, deterrence, and incapacitation. Given this public fear and public sentiment, it translates to the laws that we pass. Most of the laws that we pass eventually makes crime non-bailable. If we pass a new crime, we penalize something, of course, our first offense, first instinct is to make it a preventive detention. Make laws that are good in nature but very restrictive. Eventually, very few people will be able to utilize the law. And then, of course, the provision or non-provision of resources. So given this background, we are now going to look at the current state of prisons and jails in the Philippines. Number one problem is our inadequate facilities. During the build prison years, we were able to construct new jails in the BGMP. After that, however, we have stopped funding the construction of new buildings. Also, we have improved the salary of BGMP and Bucor personnel, that's a plus, but still we are lacking in terms of numbers of personnel. And then we are still having inadequate budget for operational resources, food, clothing, medicines, and other basic necessities. I usually bring my friends from the United Nations, from Department of Foreign Affairs of Trade in Australia and the US Embassy, and we bring them inside our jail and prisons, and they will be shocked by our situation. They say, "Oh, Raymond, how come this place is still running? This is in a brink of collapse," especially if you bring them in our mega prisons like the Bilibid prison. So that's the question. Why is our system still working despite it's being neglected for quite a long time? This leads to what we call coping mechanisms. And this is just one common picture that we have. This is in the New Bilibid Prison's maximum security compound. This is designed for 6,000 PDLs. Now it has 19,000 inmates in it. And this is how our ordinary cell looks like. As you would see, there are beds there, we call it tarima. And in this tarima, these are spaces that they develop in order to overcome the limited space, which now leads to the organizational practices that are being observed in our jail and prison facilities. For example, the lack of facilities. It translates to the presence of kubol. Naririnig niyo palagi ang kubol. Minsan, winawasak ang kubol. Minsan, ibinabalik ang kubol. Pero ang kubol ay kailangan sapagkat wala nang matulugan, selda sa loob ng kulungan. We also have kubo. Ito yung mga kubol sa labas ng selda. Mayroon ding tarima. Ito yung mga maliit na tutulugan paghapon. And we have the talipapa, where inmates now could sell stuff inside the cell. And because of this, inmates can contribute and they can construct their own basketball and tennis courts. They could have their own bakeries. They could construct their own churches and paaralan. In Bilibid, we call this the build, operate, and transfer Bilibid style. Why? Because inmates build, they operate, and they transfer the ownership to the Bucor later on. Lack of personnel. The BGMP and the Bucor says there should be one personnel for 7 inmates only. That's the ratio. In reality, it's 1:80. Sometimes it could go as much as 1:300. So, paano pasusunurin ng isang empleyado ang napakaraming mga PDLs? That's where we have the mayores system. We have the mayor, vice mayor, bastonero, kulturero, and other nanunungkulan. When I was an inmate in Quezon City Jail, I became a bastonero, a mayor, and also the mayor de mayores of the Quezon City Jail. We have the trustees or orderlies. Sila po yung tagatulong para sa mga records, para dun sa mga programa sa loob. We have the coordinators for rehabilitation, marshals for peace, and then volunteer systems. So that's how we overcome the lack of personnel. And then the pangkat. You might have heard of the pangkat. The pangkat are actually brotherhoods. Sometimes they are called the gangs. And in the Bilibid, there are 12 gangs. The Genuine Ilocano Gang, the Batang City Jail, Commando, Sige Sige, Happy Go Lucky, BRM, and many other gangs. In Quezon City Jail that I came from, there are 4 gangs in Metro Manila. Gangs now have become a mechanism for self-help and self-protection. We have also the resources being generated. You always hear of the VIP inmates. Well, VIP inmates in our local parlance is different. We call them the very important preso, VIP. And if you're able to contribute 40 pesos to 50 pesos when you are visited, that already qualifies you for a VIP. And the VIP system allows for inmates to draw funds from. Para kung nagkasakit ka, doon ka kukuha ng gamot. Kung ikaw ay lalaya na, doon ka kukuha ng pamasaya pa uwi. Kung ikaw ay walang damit, doon kukuha ng pambili ng damit mo. So it's a self-help mechanism based on the Filipino bayanihan culture. And then we have the problems of contrabands. In the United States, or would say that bawal ang pagkain, bawal ang gamot, bawal ang damit. Why? Because the government provides for it sufficiently. In the Philippines, since we lack resources, we allow them. And so we don't know what a contraband is, right? A contraband is something that's supposedly used for security. But if you now bring sardinas dahil sa kakulangan ng pagkain, it could lead to a problem indeed. So what I've observed, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are 2 rules in our system. One is the formal rule, and the other one is the informal rule. The formal rules will be in the manual of the BGMP and the Bucor. For example, in the manual, it says, no inmate shall supervise or exercise supervision over other inmates. Meaning to say, dapat po walang nanunungkulan, walang mayores system. But in reality, we know that our facility cannot run without this, what we call inmate expediters or force multipliers. And so we have an informal rule going side by side. And the presence of this dual set of rules translates into lack of clarity in our policies. I'll give you a good example that is very common. Sir Jonathan, pwede pong magpasok ng electric fan. Ano pong ating sagot? If that inmate is very good, he follows the rules, poses no problem, then nakikita mo yung sitwasyon niya, di na siya makahinga, you are going to use the humanitarian narrative. Sige, pagbigyan natin siya, nakakaawa, mamamatay na. Pero kung isang inmate lalapit, Sir Jonathan, pwede bang magpasok ng electric fan? And this inmate is recalcitrant. He doesn't follow the rules. And then he would write letters to the CHR complaining about your situation. Then, ang tawag namin dyan, tabla. Hindi ka pwedeng bibigyan. So you are now going to use the formal rules of the game. Bawal ang electric fan sapagkat dagdag kuryente. It will pose a security threat. And these dual rules translates to what we call discretionary power. It's your discretion which rule to use in a particular context. And this is what we call code switching. You switch code. You switch code every time. Depende kung sinong kausap mo. Kung yung kausap mo may context sa taas, then pambibigyan mo siya. Kung wala, tabla-tabla. And that leads now to what we call the cultural conditions. So just to explain, this is the little community we have inside the facility. We have a mayor, we have a vice mayor, we have a bastonero, we have a culturero, a mahinaria. Every set of rules and regulations could be present inside a cell in the Philippines. And as I've told you, I've documented this in my research projects before. For this cell, it has 83 inmates, of which 3,400 ang pondo ng CELDA that they generated from different mechanisms. And there are 2 groups of people, the VIP, those who contribute to the cell funds, and the buyonero. Buyonero are those individuals who clean the buyon. Buyon are the CR, restroom. So kung buyonero ka, tagalinis ka ng buyon, wala kang dalaw. So there you go, the social divide between the 2. And then I documented also the different mechanisms of generating income in our local facilities. We have the calling, pag ikaw ay nadalaw. We have the tax, kung ikaw ay nagbebenta, mayroong tax po yan sa mayor ng CELDA. Mayroon kaming palakpak, mayroon kaming VIP, and many other forms of money-making schemes inside. Tatanungin nyo ang mga BGMP and Bucor, sabihin nila, ito po ay kanilang kalakaran na yan. We try to manage it as well para hindi maabuso, but still, that's the mechanism that the inmates have developed in order to help themselves. At tatanungin nyo, saan gagamitin? Gastos sa brigada, pag nagkasakit, pamasahes, and so on and so forth. So this structural and organizational coping translates to culture. We have a unique prison culture in the Philippines. We call this the ways of doing things. Salitang pangungulungan o nangungulungan, or what we call the prisonization process. All inmates are prisonized into this situation. And as I've been released 23 years ago, I still go back to Quezon City Jail. I still see the same structures. Why? Because there's what we call cultural transmission. It's transmitted from generation and generation of PDLs. And take note, it's not only the inmates who are prisonized. Jail officers, correctional officers are prisonized as well. Kung tatanungin mo sila, okay lang tumanggap ng pera sa inmate hanggat hindi humihingi, kusang loob pinibigay. Why? Kasi alam nila kapag tatanggap sila, marami pa silang inmate na matutulungan. And I do believe the BJMP and the Bucor have been trying to overcome this, trying to train them into shifting away from this old penological culture to new penological culture. However, because of lack of resources, lack of personnel, lack of space, the temptation is quite high. And then, of course, it becomes abused, right? From humanitarian, they call it humanitarian consideration. Sir Jonathan, pwede pong magpasok ng electric fan. Walang problema. Tatlo ang ipasok mo. Isa sa iyo, isa sa akin, at isa dun sa nas nakakataas sa akin. So that's how they will look at the situation now. We call it convertible to cash attitude. Because they know that the inmates will do everything in order to lessen their dehumanized experience. Magpapasok sila ng electric fan, magbabayad sila ng napakalaki para makapasok ng electric fan. Magkapagawa sila ng kubol, magbabayad sila ng napakalaki para lang magkaroon ng kunting dignidad sa kanilang tinutulugan. Now, we cannot fault these people because they are just coping to the situations that they are dealt with. And what I've seen is that these outcomes varies from facility to facility. And it also has some short-term positive benefits. Why? Because it now supports the day-to-day management of ourselves. For example, shared governance. It becomes participatory engagement. So when I was an inmate in Quezon City Jail, I'm not only a mayor de mayores who helped the warden in dealing with the conflicts of the gangs, but I also became a teacher. Nagturo po ako ng ALS at yun po ang naging basis ngayon ng ALS para magkaroon ng ALS sa buong bansa para sa mga PDLs natin. Naging paralegal officer din po ako, kaya ang tawag nila sa akin nung ako'y inmate, Attorney Raymund. Hindi pa ako nakapasa noon ng bar at hindi pa ako naglolo. And then it provides opportunity for self-improvement. Very unique ang prison management natin sa Pilipinas. Why? Kung doktor ka sa laya, doktor ka pa rin sa loob. Kung teacher ka sa laya, instructional manager ka sa loob. Kung engineer ka sa laya, gagamitin ka nila doon sa kanilang engineering department, which shields individuals from the brutal effects of imprisonization. You bring your pre-prison characteristics inside. Sa ibang bansa, hindi po nila ginagawa yan. Kung doktor ka sa laya, wala ka sa loob. Kung kaya't paglaya mo, hindi ka na alam kung paano maging doktor. And that leads to a lot of recidivism. In the Philippines, by default, inmates are madiskarte because that's the day-to-day living. Kinakailangan mong dumiskarte. Kung marunong kang magtahi ng sapatos, you could create your own business inside. Taga-tahi at taga-ayos ng sapatos. Kung marunong ka magbenta, magbebenta ka sa loob. Kaya pag titingnan nyo, pupunta kayo sa Bilibid ngayon, para po silang mga nasa isang malaking plaza at maraming nagbebenta ng kung ano ng mga produkto. Why? Because that's their diskarte. And when the inmates go out, madiskarte po mga yan. They are very resilient. And it normalizes our situation, becomes more peaceful. However, when this is disturbed, this peace will become very, very violent indeed. And because of this, despite the recidivism rate of 30%, if compared to America, whose recidivism rate is almost 60%, we still do something that's good in the Philippines, because this is rooted in Filipino culture of bayanihan and daymayan. Having said that, however, we also document these bad outcomes, and it has long-term negative effects. And this, I believe, is what we usually see in the media. This is captured in the media every now, and it rocks our government. It embarrasses our government worldwide. Why? Because it has favoritism and inequality of treatment. Some inmates might yet go out and they have facial. Why? Because they abuse the medical pass. There's corruption of authority. Why? Because of congestion. It automatically corrupts authority. And it blurs boundaries between jail officers and prison officers and inmates. We have riots and violence. Though this seldom happens, it still leads to a lot of deaths. Human rights violations, the bizarre practices, bakit may mga selda na may jacuzzi, hotel-type amenities, swimming pools, sex toys, and iba pa. And finally, the bane of the maximum security compound, the drug trade and the drug dealing. I do believe our officers right now who were installed only very recently are doing their very best in order to overcome this. And I'm going to discuss some of these things that they're doing in a bit. Just a caveat, the maximum security compound, which is the poster boy of inefficiencies in the Philippines, is not a representative of jails and prisons. Many other jails, especially in the BGMP and also in the provincial jails, have outstanding jail management at the moment, and we have documented them as such. But still, it's the maximum security compound that get all the hits whenever there are big sensationalized news coming in. So using the theoretical framework, right? How do we understand why there's drug dealing and drug trade inside and outside of the prison? And I do believe this is one of the reasons why I was asked to present in Congress to shed light on this very depressing issue. So look first at our societal values. First, we have very punitive approaches to drugs. In many countries in the world, drug is considered a medical health problem. Ours is considered a criminal justice problem. And so what are the laws that we pass? RA 9165, which is one of the most draconian policy on drug intervention, where we incarcerate low-level drug users. And I understand where we are coming from. We don't tolerate drugs. And I do believe that is also a good reason for doing this. But then what's the effect? When we did the drug war in 2016, our system is not ready. Our prison and jail are not ready. From 60,000, it became 120,000 in just a 1 year span, almost a 100% increase. So there's congestion. And then of course, we lack personnel. There's a VIP system, the mayores and gang system, the kubols for individual privacy, and then the prevalence of cell phones so that inmates could contact their families in a manner that's appropriate. However, because of the organizational process where we rely on inmate structures to run the facilities, plus the culture of give and take relationship and corruption, that's where it leads to drug dealing. Why? Because the drug dealers have mutated. For example, an inmate, he was charged with kidnapping, carnapping. He went to Bilibid. He learned and met friends who are drug dealers. The kidnapper and the carnapper join hands. And then suddenly, what do you have? A fusion of military might and drug might inside and outside. And that's what happened in many of our big-time drug dealers when they appropriated the inmate leadership structure, when the drug leaders themselves become the gang leaders. So what has been the solution? Solution had been to destroy the cabal. Solution had been to transfer the PDLs to far away places, to identify officers who are in charge. And these are all good. These are all good. However, it's simply a stopgap measure. Why? Because it only looks at the outcome. It doesn't look at the root cause of the problem, the lack of space, the lack of personnel. It does not look at the organizational coping mechanisms that we need these to run our facilities, and then the culture that evolved. So this is the framework that I'm offering so that we could understand the problem even more. And these are indeed some legislations that could address these problems. For the next one is you look at it from the perspective of the input, throughput, and output. Again, if there's a lot of inputs, it will lead to overcongestion. If there's a slow throughput, it would lead to overcongestion. And if there's very minimal output, it will lead to congestion. And we could look this from a multiple stage as well, from the law enforcement to the courts to the corrections. And I'm going to share many of my research. We have Sir Raul here, Mama Costa here as well from the courts. We have the PPA, Yusek Deo, might be here already as well from the DOJ. We have done this research together, and we want to hear perspective from below. We want to know where they're coming from, because eventually all of us are part of the contributory problems in this aspect. So let's look from the law enforcement side. Input. Because of the public sentiment, we have aggressive law enforcement. We incarcerate low-level offenders. In the Philippines, we incarcerate people gambling in the streets, put them inside the jail, and the bail is very expensive, 30,000 pesos for gambling in the streets. Why? Because our strategy have been to arrest and detain. Detention in the Philippines has been the first resort. And when police officers file, they tend to file bailable or non-bailable offenses, or tend to file the highest amount of bail. So for example, A kills B. It could be murder, it could be homicide, or reckless imprudence resulting to homicide. It has been a practice that you aim for murder. Why? Because that leads to a non-bailable offense. Because if it's bailable, it's easy to get out. Parang walang nangyari. So that's their way of punishing already, to put you in detention. And then we also lack training on de-escalation. Many of the conflicts among neighbors could have been easily resolved if our police officers know how to de-escalate a situation. But if they don't de-escalate, they arrest and then throw one of the persons involved in detention. And this has been a practice that has been challenged lately, and the police officers said they're not doing this anymore. But if you talk to individual police officers, they say that one of their outputs for determining efficacy is the number of arrests that they have accomplished for a month. The more arrests, the better in their record. So arrest and arrest and arrest will give them promotions. And that leads to more input into our system. Throughput, how do they contribute to the delay? Well, I talked to many POW officers, and this is one of their complaints, that there's a non-adherence to the time limits in the arrest period of 12 hours, 24 hours, and 36 hours. And this leads also to congestion in the police detention. And usually, one of the reasons for delays in the court hearings is the absence of police officers. Why? Because there's one police officer, forensic officer, for example, in one province, and then he will attend to so many courts during the hearings. And because of this, if he has hearing in one, he will miss the hearing in the other. And that leads to delay in court hearings. Supposedly, the police are given options that, aside from arrest, they divert the individuals. However, in the Philippines, we don't have any legislation that allow for alternatives to arrest and detention. We have limited use of diversion programs like warning. Police officers rarely use warnings or citations. And we don't have rehabilitation programs offered at the police department. So that's a key missing link in our legislation. In terms of the prosecutorial side, they also reflect the attitude of the law enforcers. One, there's also aggressive prosecution. Again, this is because of the mandates and the social values that have been brought into them by the public. So you arrest low-level offenders. And then there's what we call low standard of evidence in filing cases. And this has been observed by the DOJ. And the DOJ, as I'll explain later, they try to introduce what we call from probable cause to prima facie evidence. Probably the Congress could look at into that as well, that there is a legislation on the threshold or the quantum of evidence. And then finally, filing of non-bailable offenses and recommending high amounts of bail. Our bail in the Philippines is very, very exorbitant, especially the bail of 2018, where the bail amounts was tripled. And the goal was that to make the individuals accountable. And that's very true. However, the consequence that so many of our poor defendants, the indigent, could not post bail. In our study, 10,000 pesos is still very difficult for an indigent accused. And then throughput for the prosecutors. Prosecutors are also lacking in number. There will be one prosecutor assigned in multiple courts. And if they are conflicted in hearings, now that leads to postponements. And barely no one adheres to what we call time limits in the stages of trial. And then output. The prosecutors also have limited use of prosecutorial diversion programs. And this is what is missing in our prosecutors. In many countries in the world, there is what we call a prosecutorial diversion. So instead of filing to court, you could divert. And as long as the individual finishes with the conditions of diversion, then they could be reintegrated back to the community. So the opposition to bail, the opposition to release on recognizance, the limited use of community service for first-time low-level offenders, and the lack of what we call supervised release programs translates into a limited output in our prosecutorial services and leads to overcapacity. And then this is for the courts. All right. For our court system, there's also what we call reliance on preventive detention. And our courts lack diversion programs as well. So the police, the prosecutors, and the courts lack diversion programs. In the United States and Western countries, for example, they have what they call the drug treatment courts. So a court will, instead of prosecuting and trying a case, divert it to a court rehab program. We don't have mental health courts. And then also, our extensive use of financial bail, which have been very common theme in all the different stages. The delay in the court proceedings, we have a number of postponement. In my research, only around 20% of court hearings push through. 80% of the time, it's postponed because of the structural conditions that we have discussed earlier. Also, we have problems with court vacancies, and Sir Raul would attest to this. And there should be a way for us to address the court vacancies. And then finally, limited output on the use of recognizance, supervised release programs, limited use of community-based programs, and non-adoption of risk assessment tools. And finally, for our Bucor and for our correctional system, we also leak risk assessments for violence, and recidivism rate leads also to more inputs in our criminal justice system. And also the long sentences, delay in the processing of application in parole and probation. Sir Calizo is here. There are so many difficulties in applying for parole. It takes at least 2 years for individuals to apply for parole and to find the results. So there should be a way for us to systematize the application for parole and probation. And then finally, we have restrictive criteria on parole and probation, pardons, executive clemency, use of GCTA, medical furloughs is not even considered in the Philippines. And we don't have programs for compassionate release programs, and lack of pre-release, which leads to recidivism. So having said all of those problems, we need to think outside the box. We need to look at the evidence and see that our goal is to rationalize the criminal justice system in order to achieve public safety, and we focus on rehabilitation and limit the cost. So after 20 years of studying this, ladies and gentlemen, we offer these many legislative reform agenda. First, probably we need to decriminalize certain offenses, gambling, for example, or the use of medical marijuana. Many countries now have legalized the use of medical marijuana. In the Philippines, it could still translate to long-term imprisonment. I've mentioned a while ago, increase the quantum of evidence for filing. The DOJ have started this, so probably we could study this and see whether it's successful, from probable cause to prima facie with certainty of evidence. And then let's introduce diversion programs. In Japan, this is called what we call assistance to the entrance for adult offenders, where you refer them to human service agencies. And this could be done by the police, by the prosecution, and by the courts. And we could introduce restorative justice during these diversion programs, similar to the JJWC. We also need to introduce legislation that offers alternatives to detentions. We should use detention as the last resort. We could use warnings, citations, and day fines. Day fines is an activity in Germany where individuals will be penalized based on the amount of income they make in a particular day. Also, many correctional systems in the world now use what we call pre-trial supervised release program, where we use a scientific tool to determine flight of risk and reoffending. And this is called the public safety assessment. So an individual who has low risk could be supervised outside and then go to hearing, attend to court, and make sure that he does not have a flight of risk. And they could be supervised while undergoing trial. I also plead to our members of Congress, please review our bail system. The Philippines is the only country, second to America, that use a financial bail. Many other countries have gotten away with financial bail systems. So we need to review the amount and manner of release. We also have the release of recognizance law in 2013, but research does suggest that only 3% are released based on this recognizance law. Why? Because of so many requirements that we put on this recognizance law. Kailangan pa po ng resolution sa sangguniang bayan at ikukulong mo ang custodian kapag hindi nagpakita ang PDL. Therefore, wala nang gustong mag-custodian. Therefore, walang gumagamit dito sa ating recognizance law. We need to revise this recognizance bill. And then we reverse the problem of we tweak our rehabilitation program. So ang nangyari po kasi ngayon, we arrest, we detain, we offer plea bargain dahil ang tagal-tagal niya sa loob ng kulungan, and then pag nag-plea bargain, sila po ay mapupunta sa probation, and then they request for rehabilitation treatment. So yung rehabilitation treatment comes at the very end. So ang pinakamaigi po rito ay baguhin natin. When you arrest, you already offer the rehabilitation treatment. And then, if they fail, that's when you detain them. And then that's when you offer the plea. So that should be the procedure. Same event, but you put the rehabilitation up front. One of the ways that we could also improve our criminal justice system is to modernize and expand the probation system. Our probation is very efficient. We have a recidivism rate of only 2%. So our probation system is actually working. Pero kakunti ang nakikinabang. Why? Because of the limitation, 6 years and below lamang. And it's only offered for first-time offenders. So if there's a way that we could legislate a new law that expand from 6 years, so probably to 12 years, or even second-timers, right, could still be given probation, that will be very good indeed. And ito po, we need to introduce capacity limits for our jail. In America, if a jail is rated at 100 bed capacity, then it should not be more than 100 bed. Kumbaga, 95% capacity lamang. Sa Philippines, takot na takot ang mga wardens po natin dahil may court order. Sa Amerika, pwede dapat tanggihan yung court order na yon. Why? Because it's over capacity. So, kinakailangang magpalaya tayo or wag muna tayo mag-aresto kung punong-puno ang ating kulungan. So that should be our policy. Otherwise, mapunong-mapuno ang ating mga kulungan. So there should be capacity limits similar to hospitals. And then, we need to introduce what we call second chance or clean slate or ban the backs. And this has been introduced by Congressman Abalos, wherein kapag na-serve na ng sentence ng PDL ang kanyang sentensya, wag na dapat tatanungin ito kung siya ay nag-apply ng trabaho, especially if he had been released from 5 years ever since. So we need to have a 5-year rule similar to what is done in Brazil. Good afternoon, Yusek Deo. Thank you for your presence. And then here, we need to request Congress for more additional courts, address the court vacancy. We need more prosecutors and public attorneys. We have very few courts compared to our nationwide population. And I've been hoping that we could introduce judges in waiting in the appointment of judges, that once you already hurdle the JBC, you are considered a judge in waiting para hindi na masyadong matagal ang pag-appoint mula sa Malacanang. And then finally as well, we hope that we could review the Speedy Trial Law of 1998. The speedy trial law suggests that there should be time limits. Unfortunately, no one has enforced this properly. That's why nagtatagal kahit 23 years ang isang PDL. And then we hope to have efficiency in the organizational practices, especially in calendaring of hearings. We address the postponements and introduce the notion of sure trials, where there should be trials set for a particular day, pero matuloy yun at continuous. And I do believe the Supreme Court is doing a lot in order to meet these sure trials. For our prisons, especially in the Bilibid, we have been advocating for small, manageable regional prisons. And jails and prisons should not be more than 1,000 bed in capacity. Because kung lagpas na po ng 1,000, hirap na po ang mga empleyado natin patakbuhin ang kulungan na ito. And we need to address ratio problems. Additional jail and prison officers, more parole and probation officers, para po dun sa mga inapruhan ng boards of pardons, mayroon pong nag-supervise po sa kanila. And this is a question that I get all the time. Should we integrate the BJMP, the provincial jail, the Bucor, the parole and probation administration, and the boards of pardons and parole? Why? Because these are all agencies working together, but they are housed in different departments. So if they have been the same department, they might work together. And then they could work on the same domains of work, like classification, housing, programming, and documentation. And this could be done in the 3 agencies, BJMP, Bucor, parole and probation, and then their uniformity in their efforts. Also, we need to expand and modernize our parole. Parole is a very good tool. However, very few are being given or granted parole. Why? Because the procedures is very tedious. So nasa-serve na lang nila ang kanilang sentence, hindi pa sila lumalaya. We also could introduce what we call the 15-year rule. In many countries in the world, they cap the length of sentence to 15 years, especially if they have good behavior. After 15 years, they should be released on parole supervision. And in fact, we could introduce a legislation called split penalty. Split penalty is when a judge could order 4 years in prison and 4 years in parole. And that will be what we call a split sentence. And then we could introduce medical furlough for individuals 60 years old and over, and those who have served 5 years of their sentence. And then finally as well, rationalize the use of the GCTA law. GCTA law has been a tool that should decongest the jail. But of course, because of the abuses it happened, now it has very limited use. Many people are disqualified with the use of GCTA law. So probably we have to review whether they are truly disqualified. So overall, this is how the integrated reform of our criminal justice system should look like. We reduce the input from our law enforcement, fast track the throughput in our court systems, and maximize the output through release and parole, probation, and community corrections. And all these agencies should work hand in hand through the support of our legislators. So in conclusion, this is what I'm going to say. We need to rationalize our criminal justice system. We could still be tough on crime, yes, but tough on crime on the real criminals. We don't have to be tough on crime on everyone else. We use detention as a last resort. We use the detention and reserve it to the most deserving. The limited space should be for the most deserving. And how could we do it? By using evidence-based approaches, by using risk assessment tools, where you could identify the low risk, the medium risk, and the high risk. And that's what we've been doing in parole, probation, Bucor, and BJMP. So if you use this, it will be more focused, it will be more rehabilitative, and less costly in the long run. I've made a simple analysis. If we simply transfer around 20,000 inmates who are languishing in BJMP jails and Bucor prisons to parole and probation, we could save 1 billion pesos at least in 1 year for food budget alone. And so if we expand the community corrections, minimize the institutional corrections, we could save much on cost. And eventually, this would lead to public safety, lesser recidivism, and this will also lead to better community conditions in our localities. It will increase trust to our legal system. We could gain their confidence back that our justice system truly works. So this is my final appeal again. This was being taken in 2016. I visited the Quezon City Jail. I've experienced the problems firsthand. That's why I make this appeal in behalf of all those inmates who are languishing in behind bars. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Narag, for the comprehensive and very enlightening presentation. We are not here today to put anyone in the hot seat. We are here to see how we can help the correctional system through legislation. And I want to thank all the government agencies who are here today for their presence. This shows that there's a desire to make some changes. I know we have limitations, especially when it comes to the budget, but I hope we can improve the system and make a difference. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of some of our members. Honorable Ruel Peter Gonzaga, our Vice Chairperson. Honorable Loreto Acharon, another Vice Chairperson. Honorable Joseph Stephen Paduano, and Honorable Ramon Rodrigo Gutierrez, and lastly, Honorable Zaldi Villa. So now we will open the floor for our members to ask questions, and then we will listen to, if with your indulgence, we will listen to resource persons first. We will start with the DOJ, represented by the Yusek Marco. You have any comments, please?
Good morning to the members of this body. Good morning, Madam Chair. Dr. Narag had already given this presentation to us, the DOJ, and he has been working with us, and we have been actually using his services. He's been our main focus in the DOJ right now is to decongest, because after we heard the first time we heard the presentation of Professor Narag, we were actually surprised that the believe it is the biggest penitentiary in the whole world. So we have to do something about that. And we have been releasing a lot of PDLs. Every month we release at least 400 PDLs, and so far we have released 6,000 during the time of President Bongbong Marcos. And we have pending legislation also. I think there's already a TWG on the probation law. We're going to amend that also. The biggest problem right now that we're experiencing is the lack of manpower, aside from budget, of course. Manpower for the PPA, we need to strengthen the PPA. If we're going to make use of alternatives to incarceration, we need more people from the PPA. So I really appreciate you inviting us today, Madam Chair, and thank you, Professor Narag.
Thank you, Yusek Marco. DLG, Attorney Alday, you have any comments?
Good afternoon, Honorable Chair and members of the committee. The DALG is currently discussing with the BJMP regarding the numbers of the PDLs released. No, currently they have the numbers, so may I refer to them for updates regarding the court decongestion programs of the BJMP and DALG.
They will have their chance later. So is there anything else that you would like to bring up?
None, Your Honor.
Office of the Court Administrator. They were talking about speedy trial earlier.
Yes,
Dr. Narag was talking about speedy trial and the delay in the disposition of cases. Can you enlighten us, Court Administrator Villanueva?
Yes po. Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chairperson and the honorable members of this committee. Of course, I had the opportunity to listen to the presentation done earlier by Dr. Raymund Narag when I joined a seminar, sponsored by the UNODC in Bangkok, Thailand. At any rate, may I just state that for one, with respect to his request, or at least observation regarding some detention prisoners being incarcerated for more than 20 years and still no decision with respect to the case involving that particular detainee. We already issued the circular directing or at least informing our judges to give priority to aging cases. In fact, this has resulted in many of our aging cases since last year up to this year being decided by our judges. And the reason is, of course, to ensure that prolonged detention is avoided, especially for those who have been incarcerated already for a long period of time. Likewise, with respect to the release of detention prisoners or even those serving a sentence already, we likewise issued a circular last year stating, for one, that there is no need, no, especially for those serving sentence, there is really no need for the court to issue a release order. Usually, this is the reason being used, or at least being cited, no, by some detention facilities in not releasing detainees who have already served their sentence. So we made it very clear that there is no need for the judges to be involved insofar as releasing these convicted, no, especially convicted felons are concerned. And in fact, we even suggested very clearly that in computing the GCTA, the courts do not have any, there's no need for the courts to even be involved. Any question arising from the computation of the GCTA, whether correct or not, should not be brought